The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Sarah Martinez adjusted her helmet for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the overwhelming excitement that had been building for months. At 23, she was about to attempt her first solo landing in a military aircraft, something she had dreamed of since childhood. Sarah had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home throughout her youth. The constant uncertainty had taught her to be self-reliant, but it had also left her with an aching void where family memories should have been. She knew nothing about her real parents except that her mother had died when she was 3, and her father's identity remained a mystery locked away in sealed records. The aviation program had become her salvation. When she aged out of the foster system at 18, Sarah had enlisted in the Air Force with a singular goal: to become a pilot. Her instructors were impressed by her natural talent and unwavering determination. She had an intuitive understanding of aircraft mechanics and an almost supernatural ability to read wind patterns and weather conditions. Standing beside the training aircraft, Sarah reviewed the flight checklist one final time. The plane was a modest training model, nothing like the advanced fighters that soared overhead during regular drills, but to her, it represented everything. This single landing would determine whether she could advance to the next phase of her training or be reassigned to ground duties. Her flight instructor, Captain Williams, approached with a reassuring smile. He had been working with Sarah for 6 months and had never seen a student more dedicated to mastering every aspect of flight. During their training sessions, Sarah absorbed information like a sponge, asking detailed questions about engine performance, navigation systems, and emergency procedures. The captain had noticed something unique about Sarah's flying style. She had an almost instinctive connection with the aircraft, as if she could sense its needs before the instruments registered any changes. Her landings during dual control sessions had been consistently smooth, demonstrating a level of precision that typically took years to develop. As Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection, she thought about the conversation she had with Captain Williams the previous week. He had mentioned that her flying reminded him of someone from his early career, but when pressed for details, he had simply shaken his head and changed the subject. The control tower crackled to life, granting Sarah permission for takeoff. She settled into the cockpit, running through the familiar sequence of switches and gauges. The engine roared to life, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied every flight. This was where she belonged, suspended between earth and sky, master of her own destiny. During the flight, Sarah practiced the approaches she had rehearsed countless times in the simulator. The landscape below looked like a detailed map, with roads threading between patches of farmland and small towns. She had studied this route so thoroughly that she could navigate it with her eyes closed. As she prepared for the final approach, Sarah noticed several high-ranking officers gathered near the observation tower. This was unusual for a routine training flight, but she pushed the distraction from her mind. She needed complete focus for the landing that would define her future. The aircraft responded perfectly to her commands as she began her descent. Years of studying flight manuals and watching experienced pilots had prepared her for this moment. She adjusted the throttle with subtle precision, feeling the aircraft settle into the optimal glide path. Unknown to Sarah, one of the officers watching from the observation deck was General Robert Martinez, a decorated fighter pilot with 30 years of service. He had built his reputation during several overseas deployments and was known throughout the Air Force for his exceptional leadership and tactical expertise. The general had not planned to observe training flights that morning, but he had been walking past the airfield when something caught his attention. The aircraft's approach pattern seemed familiar, executed with a smoothness that reminded him of his own flying style from decades past. As Sarah's aircraft touched down with barely a whisper against the runway, General Martinez felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The landing was flawless, demonstrating a level of skill that he had seen in very few pilots throughout his career. There was something about the pilot's technique that stirred memories he had tried to bury for 20 years. Sarah taxied the aircraft to its designated position, her heart pounding with relief and triumph. She had done it. The landing had been perfect, smooth enough that she barely felt the wheels make contact with the runway. As she shut down the engine and removed her helmet, she caught sight of the officers still gathered near the observation tower. Captain Williams was the first to reach her aircraft, his face beaming with pride. He had known Sarah would succeed, but the quality of her landing had exceeded even his optimistic expectations. As he helped her climb down from the cockpit, he noticed the group of officers approaching. The general walked with measured steps, his eyes fixed on the young pilot. Something about her posture, the way she carried herself, triggered a flood of memories he had spent years trying to suppress. When Sarah turned to face the approaching officers, removing her flight helmet completely, General Martinez stopped dead in his tracks. The young woman's face bore features that were achingly familiar. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, even the way she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, all combined to create a resemblance that made the general's breath catch in his throat. Sarah stood at attention as the officers approached, unaware of the emotional storm brewing in the general's mind. She had no idea that her successful landing had just set in motion a series of events that would forever change both their lives. The general struggled to maintain his composure as Captain Williams began making introductions. The name Sarah Martinez hit him like a physical blow, confirming suspicions that had been building since he first watched her aircraft touch down. Could this remarkable young pilot really be the daughter he had lost so many years ago? General Martinez fought to keep his voice steady as Captain Williams completed the introductions. Sarah stood before him, her chin raised with quiet confidence, completely unaware that she was face to face with the father who had been searching for her for 20 years. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he could see her clearly. She had inherited his dark hair and determined jawline, but her eyes held a warmth that reminded him painfully of Maria, his late wife. The general's mind raced back to that terrible night when everything had fallen apart. 20 years earlier, Robert Martinez had been a young captain, married to his college sweetheart Maria. They had been blissfully happy with their 3-year-old daughter Sarah, living in base housing at a remote installation. Maria had been battling a serious illness, but they had both believed she would recover. The night Maria died, Robert had been away on an emergency deployment. By the time he received word and rushed home, Maria was gone, and Sarah had been taken into protective custody. The social worker explained that without any immediate family available, and with Robert's unpredictable military schedule, they had determined that foster care would be in Sarah's best interest. Robert had fought the decision desperately, but the legal system moved slowly, and his military obligations kept pulling him away. Each time he returned from deployment, he found that Sarah had been moved to a different foster home. The trail grew colder with each passing month. Eventually, when Sarah turned 5, her foster family had moved to another state. The adoption records were sealed, and despite hiring private investigators and spending his entire savings, Robert could never track her down. The guilt and grief had consumed him, driving him to throw himself into his military career with single-minded determination. Now, standing on the airfield where his daughter had just completed a perfect landing, General Martinez struggled with emotions he had buried for decades. Should he reveal who he was immediately? What if he was wrong? What if this remarkable young woman wanted nothing to do with the father who had failed to find her? Sarah noticed the general's intense scrutiny, but attributed it to professional evaluation of her performance. She had heard of General Martinez by reputation, knowing he was considered one of the finest pilots in Air Force history. Having his attention felt both intimidating and inspiring, Captain Williams proudly recounted the details of Sarah's training progress, emphasizing her natural aptitude and exceptional dedication. He mentioned that she had grown up in foster care, but had overcome every obstacle through sheer determination and hard work. The general's heart clenched at this confirmation. His daughter had faced challenges alone that no child should have to endure. While he had been climbing the ranks and earning decorations, she had been navigating the uncertain world of foster care, developing the strength and independence that now made her such an impressive pilot. During the conversation, General Martinez carefully asked about Sarah's background, trying to gather information without seeming inappropriately personal. She answered his questions with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to explaining her unconventional upbringing to military officials. Sarah mentioned that she had no memory of her biological parents but had always felt drawn to aviation. She described recurring dreams of flying that had started in childhood, dreams so vivid that she would wake up feeling as though she had actually been soaring through clouds. The general's breath caught when she described these dreams. Maria used to tell 3-year-old Sarah bedtime stories about magical flights through the sky, tales that had helped their daughter fall asleep during Maria's most difficult nights in the hospital. As the group walked toward the operations building, Sarah found herself oddly comfortable in the general's presence. Despite his intimidating rank and reputation, something about him felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. His questions seemed genuinely interested rather than merely professional. General Martinez noticed that Sarah unconsciously mirrored some of his gestures and mannerisms. When she explained technical aspects of her flight, she used hand movements that were remarkably similar to his own teaching style. The similarities went beyond mere coincidence. Inside the operations building, the general requested Sarah's complete training file, claiming he was considering her for an advanced program. Captain Williams was surprised but pleased, knowing that General Martinez rarely took personal interest in individual trainees, unless they showed exceptional promise. As Sarah excused herself to complete her post-flight paperwork, General Martinez studied her personnel file with growing certainty. Her birth date matched exactly. Her place of birth was listed as the same city where he had been stationed when Maria died. Even her blood type matched what he remembered from childhood medical records. The file contained limited information about her foster care experience, but what was there painted a picture of a resilient young woman who had excelled academically, despite multiple home changes. Her psychological evaluations noted exceptional emotional intelligence and leadership potential. Most significantly, the file mentioned that Sarah had been found as a toddler with a small locket that contained a photograph of a woman and man in military uniform. The photograph had been too damaged to make clear identifications, but Sarah had kept the locket throughout her childhood moves. General Martinez's hands trembled as he read this detail. He remembered that locket well. It had been Maria's most treasured possession, containing their wedding photo. Maria had insisted on putting it around Sarah's neck during her final days in the hospital, saying it would help their daughter remember them both. The general realized he needed to approach this situation carefully. Even if he was certain of Sarah's identity, revealing the truth would be life-changing for both of them. She had built her identity around being independent and self-sufficient. Learning that her father had been searching for her might be overwhelming. He also had to consider the professional implications. As a general, he needed to ensure that any special attention he gave Sarah would be perceived as merit-based, rather than personal favoritism. Her career deserved to advance on its own strengths. That evening, General Martinez sat in his office long after normal duty hours, staring at Sarah's training photographs and comparing them to the few pictures he still carried of Maria and 3-year-old Sarah. The resemblance was undeniable, but 20 years of separation had created a chasm that couldn't be bridged with simple recognition. He decided to investigate further before revealing his suspicions. If this remarkable pilot was truly his daughter, he owed it to both of them to be absolutely certain before disrupting the life she had built for herself. The general began making discreet inquiries into Sarah's adoption records, using his military connections to access information that had been sealed for decades. He also started reviewing her training schedule, looking for opportunities to observe her progress without appearing to show favoritism. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to her quarters that evening with a strange sense of anticipation. Something about her encounter with General Martinez had stirred emotions she couldn't quite identify. For the first time since childhood, she found herself wondering seriously about her biological family and the circumstances that had led to her placement in foster care. Over the following weeks, General Martinez found himself creating opportunities to observe Sarah's training progress. He attended flight briefings he would normally delegate to subordinates, and made unexpected visits to the training facilities when her squadron was scheduled for exercises. Each interaction deepened his conviction that Sarah was his lost daughter, but it also revealed the extraordinary person she had become, despite the challenges she had faced. Her fellow trainees respected her leadership abilities, and her instructors consistently praised her technical skills and unwavering professionalism. Sarah began noticing the general's increased presence around the training facilities. While other students might have felt intimidated by such high-level scrutiny, she found herself looking forward to their brief conversations. General Martinez had a way of asking questions that challenged her to think more deeply about aviation theory and military strategy. During one particularly complex training exercise, Sarah's squadron encountered simulated emergency conditions that required quick decision-making under pressure. She had been assigned as flight leader for the mission, responsible for coordinating the responses of 5 other aircraft. when the exercise controller introduced multiple system failures and adverse weather conditions. Several pilots in Sarah's formation began to panic. Radio chatter became chaotic as less experienced aviators struggled to process the rapidly changing scenario. Sarah's voice cut through the confusion with calm authority that impressed even the veteran instructors monitoring the exercise. She quickly assessed the situation, assigned specific roles to each pilot, and guided the formation through a series of coordinated maneuvers that successfully completed the mission objectives. General Martinez watched the exercise from the control room, his pride mixed with amazement at Sarah's natural leadership abilities. Her decision-making process reminded him of his own approach during actual combat situations. She had an intuitive understanding of group dynamics and crisis management that couldn't be taught in any classroom. After the debriefing, Captain Williams approached General Martinez with obvious excitement. He had never seen a trainee handle such complex scenarios with the composure Sarah had demonstrated. He recommended that she be fast-tracked for advanced tactical training, noting that her abilities exceeded those of pilots with years more experience. The general agreed to consider the recommendation, but asked for detailed psychological evaluations and background checks before making any decisions. He needed to be certain that his personal feelings weren't influencing his professional judgment about Sarah's capabilities. During this period, General Martinez had been working quietly with military legal experts to access Sarah's sealed adoption records. The process was complicated by jurisdictional issues and privacy laws, but his rank and connections eventually opened doors that had been closed for 20 years. The records confirmed his worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. Sarah had indeed been his daughter, taken into care after Maria's death when he had been deployed overseas. The documents revealed the bureaucratic failures that had prevented their reunion, including lost paperwork, jurisdictional disputes, and communication breakdowns between different agencies. Most painfully, the records showed that Robert had been geographically close to Sarah on several occasions during her childhood. There had been times when he was stationed less than 100 miles from her foster homes, completely unaware of her proximity. The files also contained detailed reports from Sarah's various foster families. Most had been positive, praising her intelligence and resilience, but some had been less favorable. She had experienced several placement failures, including one family that had returned her to the system after only 3 months, citing her stubborn independence and unrealistic dreams about flying. Reading these reports, General Martinez gained a deeper appreciation for the strength his daughter had developed. Each placement change had taught her to rely on herself, to adapt quickly to new situations, and to pursue her goals despite skepticism from adults who should have been supporting her dreams. The psychological evaluations in her military file painted a picture of a young woman who had transformed potential trauma into exceptional emotional intelligence. Her counselors noted that while Sarah maintained healthy relationships with peers and mentors, she had clearly learned to protect herself from emotional vulnerability. This information gave General Martinez pause. If he revealed his identity now, after Sarah had spent 20 years believing she was completely alone in the world, how would she react? Would she welcome the connection, or would she see his sudden appearance as another disruption in a life that had finally achieved stability? He decided to spend more time getting to know the person Sarah had become before making any life-changing revelations. During their professional interactions, he began sharing stories from his own early career, describing challenges he had faced and lessons he had learned. Sarah found herself drawn to these conversations. General Martinez had a way of relating experiences that resonated with her own struggles and aspirations. His insights into military leadership and aviation excellence aligned perfectly with her own developing philosophy about service and professional growth. One evening, after a particularly successful training mission, General Martinez invited Sarah to join him for coffee in the officers' club. He explained that he was considering several promising pilots for a special assignment and wanted to discuss her career goals in more detail. During their conversation, Sarah opened up about her childhood experiences more than she ever had with a superior officer. She described the loneliness of foster care, but also emphasized how it had taught her to be self-reliant and determined. She spoke passionately about her love of flying and her desire to serve her country with distinction. General Martinez listened with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. His daughter had become an exceptional person, but she had achieved that growth through struggles that should never have been necessary. Her strength was inspiring, but it had been forged in circumstances that still filled him with guilt. Near the end of their conversation, Sarah mentioned the damaged locket she had carried since childhood. She described it as her only connection to a past she couldn't remember, a reminder that somewhere in her history, there had been people who had cared about her. The general's throat tightened as she spoke. He wanted desperately to tell her that those people had been her parents, that her father was sitting across from her at that very moment. But he also recognized that this revelation would fundamentally alter the relationship they were beginning to build. Instead, he asked if she would be willing to show him the locket sometime, explaining that he had become interested in military history and family artifacts. Sarah agreed, touched that someone of his stature would care about her personal mementos. That night, General Martinez sat in his quarters holding his own copy of the photograph that had been in Sarah's locket. It was their wedding photo, taken on a sunny afternoon when he and Maria had been young and full of dreams about their future together. He had spent 20 years mourning the loss of his wife and daughter, never imagining that his little girl would grow up to become the kind of person he would admire, even if they weren't related. Sarah had exceeded every hope he had ever held for her future. The question now was whether revealing the truth would help or harm the remarkable woman she had become. The following week brought an unexpected challenge that would test both Sarah's abilities and General Martinez's emotional resolve. A severe weather system had grounded most training flights, but an emergency medical evacuation required an experienced pilot to transport a critically injured soldier to a specialized hospital. The mission was technically beyond Sarah's current certification level, but the weather conditions had made it impossible for the regular medical transport crews to fly safely. Captain Williams suggested that Sarah might be capable of handling the flight, given her exceptional performance in adverse conditions during training. General Martinez found himself in an impossible position. As a commanding officer, he knew that Sarah was technically qualified for the mission and might be the injured soldier's best chance for survival. As a father, the thought of sending his daughter into dangerous weather conditions filled him with terror. The decision was complicated by time constraints. The injured soldier was deteriorating rapidly, and delays in transportation could prove fatal. Sarah volunteered immediately when briefed on the situation, demonstrating the same selfless commitment to service that had characterized her entire military career. Against his every paternal instinct, General Martinez authorized the mission. He couldn't allow his personal feelings to override his professional judgment, especially when a life hung in the balance. Sarah's training had prepared her for exactly this type of challenge. As Sarah prepared for the emergency flight, General Martinez made an unprecedented decision. He announced that he would personally accompany the mission as an observer, ostensibly to evaluate her performance under real-world conditions. In reality, he couldn't bear the thought of his daughter facing such dangers alone. The medical transport aircraft was larger and more complex than the trainers Sarah had been flying, but she adapted quickly to its systems. Her pre-flight inspection was thorough and professional, demonstrating the meticulous attention to detail that had impressed all of her instructors. During the flight, General Martinez watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety as Sarah navigated through challenging weather conditions with remarkable skill. She communicated clearly with air traffic control, made continuous adjustments for wind shear and turbulence, and maintained perfect coordination with the medical team caring for their patient. The storm system forced them to alter their planned route multiple times, requiring split-second decisions about altitude changes and course corrections. Sarah handled each challenge with the calm competence of a veteran pilot, never showing signs of stress or uncertainty. At one point during the flight, severe turbulence caused the medical equipment to shift dangerously. Sarah immediately adjusted their altitude and heading to find smoother air, potentially saving both their patient and the medical personnel working to keep him stable. General Martinez realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Under pressure that would challenge even experienced pilots, his daughter was performing with a level of skill and composure that exceeded his highest expectations. She wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. The landing at the destination hospital was executed flawlessly despite crosswinds that pushed the aircraft's operational limits. Sarah touched down so smoothly that the medical team was able to continue their work without interruption. immediately transferring their patient to the waiting emergency room staff. As they prepared for the return flight, the chief medical officer at the hospital approached Sarah personally to thank her for the life she had just saved. He explained that the injured soldier would make a full recovery because of her willingness to fly in conditions that other pilots had deemed too dangerous. During the flight back to base, General Martinez found himself struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. He had just watched his daughter risk her life to save a stranger, demonstrating the kind of courage and selflessness that defined the best qualities of military service. Sarah noticed the general's quiet mood during the return flight and asked if her performance had been satisfactory. She was characteristically focused on improvement, always seeking feedback that would help her become a better pilot. General Martinez assured her that her performance had been outstanding, but privately he was grappling with the realization that he couldn't continue hiding his identity much longer. Sarah deserved to know that her father had witnessed her moment of triumph, that he was proud of the person she had become. Back at the base, word of Sarah's successful emergency mission spread quickly through the aviation community. Fellow pilots and instructors sought her out to congratulate her on handling such a challenging situation with apparent ease. Captain Williams formally recommended Sarah for accelerated promotion and advanced flight training, noting that her performance under pressure had demonstrated readiness for increased responsibilities. He suggested that she be considered for assignment to one of the Air Force's most elite squadrons. That evening, General Martinez requested a private meeting with Sarah in his office. He explained that her performance during the medical evacuation had been exemplary, and that he was prepared to offer her several career advancement opportunities. As they discussed her future options, Sarah mentioned that she had always wondered about her biological family's military connections. She explained that her natural aptitude for aviation had made her curious about whether her parents might have had similar interests or abilities. The conversation provided General Martinez with a natural opening to begin revealing the truth, but he found himself hesitating. Sarah's career was at a crucial juncture, and he worried that personal revelations might distract her from the professional opportunities she had earned through her own merit. Instead, he asked more detailed questions about her childhood memories and the locket she had mentioned. Sarah agreed to bring the damaged photograph to their next meeting, explaining that she had always hoped someone might be able to help her identify the people in the image. General Martinez spent a sleepless night weighing his options. The successful medical evacuation had proven beyond doubt that Sarah was ready for advanced responsibilities, but it had also demonstrated the dangerous nature of the missions she would be undertaking. As her father, he wanted to protect her from harm. As her commanding officer, he knew that her exceptional abilities would be wasted in routine assignments. The conflict between his personal and professional roles was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The next morning, Sarah appeared at General Martinez's office carrying a small, worn jewelry box. Inside was the damaged locket that had been her only link to her unknown past. She handled it carefully, explaining that despite its poor condition, it represented her most treasured possession. As General Martinez examined the locket, his hands trembled slightly. Despite 20 years of damage and wear, he could still make out the faces in the photograph. It was indeed the wedding picture of him and Maria, taken on what had been the happiest day of their young lives. Sarah watched the general's reaction with growing curiosity. His emotional response to her family photograph seemed far more intense than casual interest would explain. For the first time, she began to suspect that there might be more to their connection than professional mentorship. The moment had arrived when General Martinez could no longer avoid the truth that would change both their lives forever. General Martinez held the locket with hands that shook despite his efforts to maintain composure. Sarah watched his reaction with growing concern, wondering if she had somehow offended him by asking for help with such a personal matter. The silence stretched between them until Sarah gently asked if he was feeling well. The general looked up at her with eyes that glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time since their initial meeting, she saw past his military bearing to the deeply emotional man beneath. Taking a steadying breath, General Martinez carefully placed the locket on his desk and reached into his personal files. He withdrew a pristine copy of the same wedding photograph, one that had been protected in his wallet for over 20 years. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the identical image. Her heart began racing as the implications of this impossible coincidence began to sink in. She looked back and forth between the two photographs, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. General Martinez's voice was barely above a whisper as he began to explain. He told her about Maria, her beautiful mother who had fought bravely against illness but had ultimately lost the battle when Sarah was just 3 years old. He described the desperate deployment that had taken him away during Maria's final days, and the bureaucratic nightmare that had followed. As he spoke, Sarah felt her carefully constructed world beginning to shift. The father she had imagined in childhood fantasies had been searching for her all along. He wasn't absent by choice but had been prevented from finding her by circumstances beyond either of their control. The general continued his explanation, describing the years of searching, the private investigators, the false leads, and the gradual acceptance that he might never find his daughter. He spoke of the guilt that had consumed him, the way he had thrown himself into his military career to escape the pain of his failure as a father. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her analytical mind working to verify the details against her own fragmented memories. The timeline matched. Her birth date, birthplace, and the mysterious circumstances of her entry into foster care all aligned with his story. When General Martinez finished speaking, Sarah asked quietly if she could examine his copy of the photograph more closely. In the clear image, she could see details that had been obscured in her damaged locket. The young man in the photograph had the same determined jawline she saw in the mirror every morning, the same dark eyes that had always seemed familiar when she looked at General Martinez. The evidence was overwhelming, but Sarah found herself struggling with emotions she had never expected to feel. Throughout her childhood, she had alternately hoped for and dreaded this moment. The reality was more complex than any scenario she had imagined. Part of her felt overwhelming joy at finally knowing where she came from, at having the family connection she had always craved. But another part felt angry about the lost years, the loneliness she had endured, and the way their reunion had been complicated by their military relationship. General Martinez watched his daughter process this life-changing revelation, giving her time to work through the emotions he recognized from his own journey. He had imagined this moment thousands of times, but the reality was more overwhelming than any of his fantasies had prepared him for. Sarah asked practical questions first, as was her nature. She wanted to understand the legal aspects of her adoption, the specific failures that had prevented their reunion, and the steps he had taken to search for her. Her methodical approach to processing trauma impressed him even as it broke his heart. As the initial shock began to wear off, Sarah found herself studying her father's face for resemblances she had never noticed before. His habit of running his hand through his hair when concentrating was identical to her own nervous gesture. His way of tilting his head when listening matched her own body language perfectly. The conversation lasted for hours as they began to fill in the gaps of 20 years of separation. General Martinez shared stories about Maria, helping Sarah understand the mother she couldn't remember. He described her love of flying, her strength during her illness, and her fierce determination that Sarah should grow up to be independent and strong. Sarah gradually opened up about her foster care experiences, the good families who had genuinely cared for her, and the difficult placements that had taught her resilience. She described the recurring dreams about flying that had guided her toward aviation, never knowing they might have been inherited memories of her father's career. As afternoon turned to evening, they found themselves laughing together over shared mannerisms and similar approaches to problem-solving. The professional relationship that had developed over recent weeks suddenly made perfect sense in light of their genetic connection. But the revelation also created new challenges. Sarah's career advancement opportunities would now be scrutinized for potential favoritism. General Martinez's ability to serve as her mentor would be compromised by their personal relationship. More significantly, they both had to navigate the emotional complexity of building a father-daughter relationship as adults. Sarah had developed strong psychological defenses that couldn't be dissolved overnight. General Martinez had to overcome 20 years of guilt and grief to become the father his daughter deserved. Sarah asked if she could keep both copies of the photograph, wanting to compare them more thoroughly and begin processing the reality of her family history. General Martinez gladly agreed, understanding that she needed time to integrate this new information into her understanding of herself. As their meeting concluded, They made tentative plans to continue their conversations outside the military setting. Both recognized that their relationship would need to develop in the personal sphere before they could effectively work together professionally. Sarah left her father's office in a daze, her mind reeling with the implications of everything she had learned. She had started the day as an orphaned pilot with no family connections. She was ending it as the daughter of one of the Air Force's most respected generals. The knowledge that her father had been searching for her all these years began to heal wounds she hadn't realized she was still carrying. The abandonment she had felt throughout her childhood had been an illusion, created by bureaucratic failures rather than parental indifference. At the same time, she felt overwhelmed by the pressure of living up to her father's expectations and reputation. Her achievements in aviation suddenly carried additional weight, knowing that they reflected not only her own abilities but also the legacy of her family's military service. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters studying both photographs and trying to reconcile her new knowledge with the independent identity she had spent 20 years building. She was no longer just Sarah Martinez, the self-made pilot who had overcome foster care through sheer determination. She was also Sarah Martinez, daughter of General Robert Martinez and Maria Martinez, heir to a family tradition of military service and aviation excellence that she had been unknowingly continuing throughout her career. The weeks following their revelation were filled with tentative steps toward building a relationship that neither Sarah nor General Martinez had experience navigating. They met regularly outside the military environment, usually at a quiet restaurant near the base where they could talk without the formality that their professional roles required. During these conversations, General Martinez shared stories that helped Sarah understand her family history. He told her about her grandparents, both sets of whom had passed away while she was in foster care, unaware that their granddaughter was alive. He described family traditions, holiday celebrations, and the close-knit military community that had been her extended family before Maria's death. Sarah learned that her natural mechanical aptitude had been inherited from both parents. Maria had been an aircraft mechanic before their marriage, and her technical knowledge had complemented Robert's piloting skills. Together, they had dreamed of raising a daughter who would surpass both of their achievements in aviation. These revelations helped explain Sarah's intuitive understanding of aircraft systems and her ability to diagnose mechanical problems that stumped more experienced technicians. Her talents weren't just the result of hard work and determination. They were also the expression of genetic gifts that had been passed down through generations. As their personal relationship developed, the professional complications became more apparent. Sarah's exceptional performance continued to attract attention from senior officers who were unaware of her family connection to General Martinez. Several elite units had expressed interest in recruiting her, but the general found himself conflicted about how to respond. Captain Williams, still unaware of the family relationship, approached General Martinez with concerns about potential favoritism. He had noticed the increased attention Sarah was receiving and worried that it might be based on factors other than merit. The conversation was awkward for the general, who couldn't reveal the truth without Sarah's permission.